Hello and welcome to Beyond Organic Wine. I'm Adam Huss, coming to you from Los Angeles. And if you've been watching the news, you know Los Angeles has had some devastating fires in the last week. Wendy and I are safe and in our home, which we've offered as a safe haven for others because we know many people who have been evacuated and lost their homes. The human-influenced environmental conditions that exacerbate disasters like these fires are so obvious that I don't even want to comment on them here. If you're listening to this, you already know. Everything I do with this podcast is related to questioning and changing the thinking and behaviors that inflame natural cycles to extreme, life-destroying conditions. I will say, on a personal note, though, Wendy and I got married here 10 years ago at a little summer camp that overlooked Los Angeles from the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains in Altadena. That summer camp and most of Altadena are now gone. As Wendy and I looked at photos of the charred ruins, it was hard not to be emotional. We had memories of standing on a little bridge under old oak trees and saying our vows, drinking from a glass of wine that we had made together the first year we'd got together. But the bridge is gone, and the oak trees are now charred trunks. It was easy for us to empathize with the thousands of people who had so many more memories and life-changing moments than us from living there, whose homes and all they contained are now nothing but burnt rubble. Because of the wind direction, when we found out about the devastation of Altadena, the ashes of it, and that summer camp, and those oak trees were literally raining down on us. And we realized we were breathing them in, and they were becoming part of us. We looked out at the smoke and ash-filled air, put down our phones, and hugged each other. And then we went about finding out who and how we could help. This is going to sound funny, but I've been a little self-conscious about our front yard. Because unlike most of the other houses on our street, it isn't a front yard. It's a polyculture of trees and vines and cacti and flowers and herbs, and half of it is in the early, ugly stages of establishing a married vine system with awkward young trees and vines and hay bales and what our neighbors would consider weeds growing and leaf litter and necromass decaying back into soil everywhere because it's mid-January and it hasn't rained since March of last year. And the funny part is that I've put a lot of work into making it look this ugly. And then these fires hit, and I suddenly got really clear about my yard that isn't a yard. And it occurred to me, we are way past the time when we need to waste any energy on making comfortable people feel comfortable. Act with kindness, yes, but let's speak the truth and do what we know is right, regardless if it causes some people to be uncomfortable, including especially ourselves. Because these fires, or floods, or storms, or droughts are coming for all of us. Now, this episode with Bruce Reisch is an absolute delight to share with you. And it was made possible by a former guest on this podcast who I've really enjoyed getting to know even better since we recorded his episode. He's doing something unique in the world of wine, and he recorded this sponsorship message for this episode.
Hi, this is Paul Vandenberg at Paradisos del Sol Winery and Organic Vineyard in Zillow, Washington, where we have been successfully making wine from grapes grown without pesticides for over a decade. Our wines are also ingredient labeled. ParadisosDelSol.com. I do not recommend people attempt to grow Vitis vinifera without pesticides, even though we have been able to do that. It's very difficult, and you have to be in a really sweet spot, which is not most of the planet. If you're thinking about planting grapes, you should be thinking about planting things like Bruce has been working on for decades. I would not plant Vitis vinifera today where I'm at, which is an easy place to grow Vitis vinifera. If you want to grow grapes without pesticides or very little, listen up. There's options.
Now, as Paul mentioned, his vineyard is the only zero-spray vinifera vineyard and winery in the world, and it turns out he's retiring, so he's looking for someone to take over it. This is an incredible opportunity that I would have jumped on if I were in a different place in my life, but I'm hoping the stars might align for someone out there listening to carry on this remarkable legacy.
This is Paul from Paradisos del Sol Winery and Organic Vineyard. As I've gone back and listened to Adam's many podcasts, One of the recurring themes is the difficulty for somebody, especially young people, getting started who don't have a lot of resources. I was able to start my own winery in 1999 by working for somebody else and using their facilities. And then I got some partners to invest in a vineyard where I was a sweat equity partner. I did the work, they provided the money. As I'm approaching retirement, we are open for a similar sort of arrangement. If you've been working in the industry and got some of your basics in, and you're really wishing you could figure out how to get something started on your own, reach out. Let's have a chat. Thanks.
Okay, a big thanks to Paul and his wife and partner Barbara for their sponsorship of this episode with Bruce Reisch. If you don't know Bruce, or haven't gotten to hear him speak, you are in for a treat. Bruce joined the faculty of Cornell University in New York in 1980 and spent the last 40 years specializing in developing new grape cultivars, as well as new grape breeding techniques. During this time, his program released 14 new grape cultivars, 10 of which are wine grapes that are now in use out there in the world, making wine that you can drink. It's amazing. In fact, I have one of his most popular grapes, Traminette, growing with a persimmon tree in my front yard, wine garden, here in Los Angeles. Bruce was also chair for over 10 years of the Grape Crop Germplasm Committee, a national committee overseeing U.S. Department of Agriculture efforts to preserve wild and cultivated grapevines. He has studied grapes all over the world, published many papers on a variety of topics in the realms of grape breeding and genomics, molecular genetic mapping, and marker-assisted selection. And he's won awards for the excellence of his grapes and his career achievements. Bruce talks about the qualities of most of these cultivars that were developed during his time at Cornell and gives us a historical context and an overview of current practices of grape breeding. We also discuss the possibility, almost a thought experiment, of growing a seedling vineyard to mimic the genetic variation that happens as grapes propagate and grow without human influence in forest lands. There are so many juicy tidbits throughout this conversation, it's pointless to start listing just a few. This is a fantastic, comprehensive introduction to hybrid grape culture and why it is the present and future of wine. Enjoy. Oh, and I want to also mention a special thanks to Colden Pro, who offered to connect me with Bruce. Colden is responsible for the music at the end of each episode. He's now a veteran of this podcast. And in addition to being a soulful musician, he is the assistant vineyard manager at Piscinus Ranch. Now let's do this. Hi, Bruce. Thank you for doing this. Thanks for being on the show.
Oh, glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
It's a real pleasure. I know you have I'd love for you to sort of introduce yourself and your career and specializations and where you are in the world, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. I grew up in the state of New York, mostly in New York City, and um, went to Cornell as an undergraduate. My interest in wine started there with an informal wine tasting group and a course in wine tasting at Cornell. But I was studying plant breeding and genetics, went on to obtain my PhD degree at the University of Wisconsin Madison. And then I hit the job market 1979, 1980, and was the lucky guy to apply to a couple of grape breeding positions that were open and to get the offer back in my home state from Cornell University as they were having turnover in the grape breeding program right about the same time. So in 1980, July 1980, I began uh, uh, working as a grape breeder, continuing an approximately 100-year-old program in grapevine improvement. Um, and I've been there ever since at Cornell at the Geneva location, which had been called the New York State Agricultural Experiment Station when I started. And maybe 8 or 10 years ago, it became renamed as Cornell Agritech. Um, I retired in 2023, and I'm super happy to tell you that the program continues even today under the leadership now of Maddie Oravik. So I am happy for her and happy to know that the grape breeding work that I've been so involved in for the last 40 plus years continues.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I love that you said it's, a program that was 100 years old. Was it 100 years old at the time that you
Al-
started?
Almost, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So
Records indicate that started in either 1885 or 1888.
now this phrase grape improvement program, it's sort of like, saying we're aiming for a better life. Like I guess it depends on how you define that. How was that looked at? How was that defined over that historical period of improving grapes? Like what was that? What were the ends? What was a
Yeah,
better grape?
well, in the early days, they were simply looking for better juice grapes.
Huh.
The East Coast was a great place to grow juice grapes, and they were looking for better types of juice grapes. But since the 1920s, 30s, and through Prohibition, even and um, until the program was formalized, it became increasingly involved in both seedless grape development as well as wine grape development. Um, so um, the idea being that we can do better than what we have out there. Many of the grapes used in viticulture are centuries old, were developed hundreds or thousands of years ago. And the story of how they were developed, how they were selected, how they uh, came into commerce is barely known. Um, but through genetics, we can trace back how these various grapes, like Cabernet Sauvignon and Sauvignon Blanc, might be related, and where
Hmm.
this Pinot Noir and Traminer fit into the story. Um, so we know that we're dealing with a rather narrow germplasm base um, in viticulture, and especially in wine grape breeding worldwide. So what we were looking at was trying to develop better grapes. We have a more challenging climate on the East Coast than on the West Coast. We have
To say the
um,
least. Yeah.
we have a winter to deal with, um, for one thing,
Right.
and yeah, I say that as I have my hands tucked under my legs because it's freezing down in this room. I've turned on the heat, but it's freezing here temporarily. Um, so yes, we have winter, and the grapes cannot be tucked in into a warm place for the winter. They stay put. They're not like you and I. We can't just come inside and warm up. The grapes stay outside, and they have to make it through the winter and the fluctuations in temperatures. They can really be hurt if the temperatures go up above 40 Fahrenheit for a day or two or a week, and then return back to um, 0, -5, -10. They can be hurt even if they're fully acclimated and temperatures dip below 0 or -10 or -20, which does happen. So we're looking for climate adapted grapes and also grapes that had more resistance to diseases than than the, than what is currently used in viticulture. The European grapes are not generally resistant to diseases very common in North America and diseases that spread from North America throughout the world of viticulture and back to the old world and all over. Um, but we have the genes for resistance to these diseases that provide a natural form of resistance as opposed to making it necessary to spray to control diseases. Um, so my predecessors looked at implementing some basic disease resistance and adaptation breeding in the work that they had started.
Got it. So I hear you refraining from saying words like Vitis vinifera versus, other varieties. Are you just trying to be um, speak to the general population, or do you try, or is that just, do you
Oh,
not
I
yeah,
no,
go
I
ahead.
think that was just by chance.
Okay.
The words that just came to my mind as I was spinning
Ye-
this out in my head. Um,
Gotcha.
but but
And
yeah, and I'm trying, to focus a little more on the wine grape aspects of what we've been doing. Though through the years, there have always been aspects of our program that have involved seedless table grape breeding.
right. So you, in better than so far, you've mentioned, cold hardiness or climate adaptation, as well as resilience, resistance to some of the pests and the diseases and pressures, fungal pressures. Um, did is flavor another? I mean, do you think about the idea that, you know taste change and obviously, I mean, to me, I'll, rather than ask a leading question, I'll just say, ask you to react to my statement, which is, it seems strange to me to think that we have arrived at the pinnacle of viticultural flavor in the current market grapes like Pinot Noir and Cabernet Sauvignon and Sauvignon Blanc. I mean, there's, I notice, or I would love to hear your thinking
Mhm.
in the way, as somebody who has just been in the world of grape breeding your whole life. I imagine you see the world of grapes a little differently than most people who are entrenched in this vinifera industry, the vinifera dominant industry. And I'm kind of curious, what you see, how you see things differently, and how you relate to grapes differently. Like, do you see the same divisions? Do you notice, do you think of the way that the mainstream industry approaches it as kind of chauvinistic or narrow-minded, or anything like that? I'm curious just to get your general thinking about that.
Sure. First of all, I'm accepting of all viewpoints, and yet I've also had a unique opportunity um, to experience flavors like unlike most people, because I've had a chance to taste flavors that come from crossbreeding, from combinations of grape parents that the average consumer has no exposure to.
Uh-huh.
So I've seen such diversity in the wine world that I think it's fantastic what's out there, and I'm also a lover of vinifera grapes.
Yeah.
I have some favorites that, like Pignolo, a rare variety from northern Italy.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
that I have some favorites that I would love to go back and try again and get a hold of, and if I had another 40 years, I'd make more crosses with things like Pignolo. um, and try to bring some of those flavors. I've made crosses with Saperavi,
Hmm.
another vinifera grape that does particularly well in New York State.
Huh.
Um, but yet, we can improve on these, make them more adapted. Um, I, and yeah, initially, you know what? I gave you a little rundown about what species can do for us. Um, and I think it was my omission to not mention flavors and aromas in the same breath.
Right. That's what I
Um,
was getting at. Yeah.
yeah, um, because I think, oh, I can breed a grape that's easy to grow, and it could even be high yielding. But if it makes a wine that nobody is interested in, it goes nowhere. So, and then the question is, what are people interested in? And to me, that is so dependent on each individual. Um,
Mm.
Sometimes people ask me for a recommendation. Oh, what should I try? What wine should I buy? What would I recommend this one or that one? I say I don't know your taste buds. I know mine, and each one of us have has different taste buds. We're genetically a little different too. Um, Whether we're brothers and sisters or more distantly related or totally unrelated, we were born with a different palate, a different set of taste buds. So some people taste muscat wines, for instance, and they love it. And others say, oh, soapy, that's weird, that's strange. And I'm personally on the side of the lovers of muscat, and
Yeah, me too.
uh,
Yeah.
so I see that there's a market for new hybrid grapes that might taste like some of the old ones. Like we have a variety called Traminette that
Yeah.
tastes so much like Gewürztraminer.
Yeah.
Many people would have a very hard time distinguishing the two. And
Yeah.
they both have cis rose oxide, which is the compound that is greatly responsible for the distinctiveness of Gewürztraminer.
That yeah.
Um, and we have a Chardonnay hybrid that
Uh-huh.
is quite a bit like Chardonnay. Um, but then there's room for grapes like Noire, which has its own combination of a little green pepper, a lot of black pepper, heavy colored, deep aroma. And I recently tasted a sample of Noire that was grown in Israel, and it was so different and even more richer, more complex than any Noire that I had tasted in New York or Pennsylvania or elsewhere. Um,
Hmm.
so we don't have the track record of knowledge that you have from centuries of growing Pinot Noir, a grape known since Roman times. We don't have that kind of track record knowing how best to ferment and optimize the new hybrids. Um, but I also feel that the world of wine tasters, wine consumers, is changing. That people
Hmm.
are more open to new flavors and aromas. If they're open to wines in blue bottles and wines with screw caps and some non-traditional types, they might be open to a rosé that has a little candy-like characteristic from Labrusca, or something new is also a novelty.
Yeah.
Um, whereas the from the growing aspect, um, there are many people that would be interested in something new that is also more sustainable and requires less fossil fuel input into the growing.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I love that. I mean, and I love your openness, but I imagine you must have encountered, or and maybe you've just said this is changing and people seem to be more opening, but I mean, I've imagined you've encountered some stereotypical reactions to hybrid grapes in your career and whatnot. Is that true?
Oh yes, oh yes.
I mean,
Um,
what have you had to combat in terms of prejudice or misinformation about these grapes?
um, I wouldn't say, well, I wouldn't use the word combat, but
Okay, great.
I,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Please,
I,
I
I would
love that.
say I invite the conversation. And
Okay.
I can think of a class that I was teaching at a community college, which has a course in viticulture, and one of the students had been a sommelier, um, and when we started to talk about hybrids, he said, "Yeah, the problem with hybrids is the wine quality is poor."
Mhm.
Um, and so we talked about that a little bit, and about why the thought is that the wine quality is poor, when the term hybrids cover hundreds of new varieties, um, some with high percentage of species content in their background, and some with mostly vinifera and a little bit of species background.
Right.
Um, and I think the wine world, they had gotten a pretty bad rap early on. Um, I think there were some causes for that. First of all, many of the French American hybrids, which is where many people go to, when they start talking about hybrids, many of the French American hybrids were derived from bulk producing wine grapes from southern France. They did not have elite vinifera parentage in their background. Um, the French American hybridizers were the French hybridizers were looking for bulk grape production because they had lost so much production due to phylloxera and other diseases in France. But
Right.
things like Vidal were doing well. Well, where's that come from? Ugni Blanc, the French name, or Trebbiano, the Italian name, a much
Hmm.
better quality grape itself. Um, and that's been the case when hybrids are made with better quality vinifera like Gewürztraminer. Not every seedling will be excellent, but you can find some excellent progeny when you're using some um, really good sources of quality. And you might also find some excellent quality from unexpected places because who's the arbiter of what's quality? The arbiter
Right.
is really your taste buds. And
Yeah.
going back to what I said earlier, everyone has different taste buds, and what the wine expert or the wine world says is a great wine um, may not agree with you and your taste buds. So I
Yeah.
just like to encourage people to have an open mind, and
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. That's fantastic. If we can go back, I'd love to just sort of ask, if you can give a historical overview to how grape breeding, that you're aware of, has progressed historically. I imagine when you started, it was pretty traditional, pollination, like emasculating flowers and then using pollen from other flowers, and sort of that process. And how has that changed, or what has changed in the course of that time? And are we where, like, can you give a historical sort of overview of what grape breeding looks like?
yeah, sure. That's it's really interesting that you asked that because I think that's one of the areas in my career where working with others, I think I've had some impact on how grape breeding is carried out. And um,
Lovely.
and,
Yeah.
and I could say that uh, we're still using hybridization and pollination, collecting pollen from one parent and pollinating the flowers on another, collecting the seeds. But
Right.
the one thing, big way in which it's all changed is that every seedling is subjected to a DNA analysis to see what it inherits from its two parents. And usually we have um, particular genes that we're looking for. And we know from previous analyses what genes each parent is carrying, and therefore we're looking to find those genes among the seedlings. Um, and here's um, a good example. Let's say one of our goals is to breed a grape that's not just resistant to powdery mildew, but also to downy mildew. And we know one parent has one gene for powdery mildew resistance and one for downy mildew resistance. The other parent has a, a gene for resistance to each disease, but they're both different from the first two, that they're both on different chromosomes, they both have maybe different modes of action. And what we'd like to do is combine both genes for resistance to powdery mildew from each parent and both genes for resistance to downy mildew from each parent in the seedlings that we save for further evaluation. So this is like doing f- forensic genetics. Um,
Yeah.
Forensics like you would do to solve murder mysteries, to solve crimes. Well, we're not solving any crimes, but we're trying to improve the efficiency because if I can then pick out all the seedlings from across that have all four genes, I can get it quickly down to about the best 10% of all those seedlings and plant out only the ones that are going to be have two genes for powdery mildew resistance and two genes for downy mildew resistance. Um, and maybe I have some genes for flower type and fruit quality related traits. We can throw that into the mix. And now, rather than just planting out thousands of seedlings and just field screening for
Right.
disease resistance and um, any other viticultural traits, and eventually screening for wine quality, now I can narrow it down to a pretty elite group of seedlings that I have to screen for the rest of the story, whatever I don't have DNA markers for,
Right.
just to screen with. So grape breeding these days, thanks to um, especially the USDA funding of the Vitis Gen projects, VITISGEN. These Vitis Gen projects, I was the co-lead with Lance Cadel Davidson, a USDA researcher, on the first two projects. With about $10 million of funding for 10 years of research and a team of 25 investigators across the country. And it continues these days in Vitis Gen 3, a very well funded project that's about to its halfway point in implementing DNA technology in grapevine breeding practices.
Yeah. Can you talk about what how do I put this? I've heard some interesting things about the locality of some of these things like powdery and downy. Like if you're breeding there in Geneva, you might have slightly different you know the genetics of the fungi there might be slightly different, even though they're the same species, than somebody in Vermont might have. And the need for localized breeding, or for, like you said, having more than one gene for resistance, as well as like where we are in terms of the development of these the fungal pathogens that
Yeah,
yeah, anything related to that. I just think it's really fascinating and interesting to consider.
sure. Uh, then this brings me to a really good point of the benefits of working as part of a team, because we have some fantastic um, plant pathologists that we work with in the Vitis Gen projects, and as researchers at Cornell, we have some USDA colleagues like Lance Cadel Davidson, David Gadori. Um, when they are testing plants that have one gene or two genes for powdery mildew resistance, they're testing each gene for its effect to control powdery mildew from various sources. They have their own little germplasm collection of powdery mildew types,
Hmm.
so they can inoculate leaf discs with single strains of powdery mildew that might be collected in Vermont, New York, or New Jersey, or Missouri, or California. And they're looking to see which genes um, have the greatest effect on the control of powdery mildew strains from different parts of the country or different parts of the world.
Yeah, that's great.
So that is being uh, taken into account in the work that's being done. Um, of course, as breeders, we'd like to put out disease-resistant grapes that take us down to the possibility of spraying maybe once or twice to control disease, as opposed to in New York, 10 to 12 times that you might be spraying to control disease on vinifera grapes.
Right.
And we'd like to make sure that our genes last the 30 plus year lifetime of a vineyard. We'd be uh, not doing anyone a service by putting out new varieties where the expected lifetime of the genes that we're employing might be 3 or 4 years. And then you'd be back to turning up the spray program and controlling disease in other ways. So yeah, we'd like to make sure that whatever genes we're deploying, that we're deploying the right combinations and the right genes to be stable and long lasting. So that's some of the ongoing research now, is to learn about the best, the most stable genes that are out there. And one of them, I believe, comes from the muscadine grape that's already been put into a European grape background, or a 38 chromosome background, and that's called Run One. Um,
Hmm.
and to learn how to make sure that those genes last for us, because the longer they're out there, the more there's a chance for there to be some mutation in the pathogen population to overcome that resistance gene. So there are things we can do to stave that off, and some of that could be using the right gene combinations, and some of that could be using occasional um, sprays, like occasional sulfur sprays, for instance, to
Mm,
knock back whatever population of or whatever strains might be building up in a vineyard.
gotcha. Yeah. Um, it sounds in a way like eh, the more diversity of genetics for resistance you can get, the sort of the more long lasting that potential resistance would be. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's a good hypothesis, and I hope you're right about that. But I would say that's an active area of research right now.
Gotcha. Okay.
We um, It might come down to finding complementary modes of action, and
Okay.
sometimes even if we know about where a gene is located, we don't know exactly which gene it is. We have grapevine genomes that are completely sequenced, but it still takes a little work to go from the sequence and the approximate location to what is that gene, and then define exactly what the mode of action is. Um, so we might have to find grapes that have genes that have complementary modes of action. Um, I like what you're saying about diversity, but it's, yet to be fully vetted.
Right.
Um, just what will lead to the most stable and long-lasting combinations of genes.
What other unknowns are there in these investigations that I mean, I'm sure there's many, but which ones are fascinating to you? Like which ones do you find most interesting to explore
Well,
right now?
in the last few years of my career, as we cut back on way back on the spray program and our disease resistance breeding program, we saw some other diseases coming in that I wasn't even aware might be in the area. Um, and
What such
uh,
as
like anthracnose
ah, gotcha.
comes to mind. Um, and that might have been there, but you wouldn't see it in commercial vineyards due to spray programs for other known diseases. But it might also be that with climate change, it's been creeping up from the more subtly areas where it's known to be, where it's
Right,
known
right.
to exist. So climate change is coming in there. We're making um, crosses 1 to 2 weeks earlier than during the first 20 to 30 years of my career. Um, so grapes were flowering earlier,
Mm,
finished flowering earlier. Uh, so looking at new diseases, and as we cut back on spray programs, what other diseases do we need to get a handle on? I think black rot is another one of those.
I was going to
Um,
ask about black rot. Yeah, it seems like,
yeah.
are there any varieties out there, or have there been any genes identified for black rot resistance?
Yes, there
Oh,
have been. Um,
fantastic. So it's only a matter of time.
yeah. Um, we've done some of that work. We had done some of that work in our lab, but we didn't get it down to a result where we had enough consistency across years to publish. But there were some publications on black rot resistance genes from Germany and Italy where they'd been investigating um, species from North America, North American germplasm.
Hmm.
Um, and there are good DNA markers for black rot resistance, so that could also be employed in DNA forensics for grapevine breeding. Um, so um,
Are there
so
any current varieties that have that resistance that you're aware of? The black rot resistance?
yeah, I can't reel off the names off the top of my head, um,
Okay.
but there are some tables online. Um, where you can look at comparisons of black rot resistance among many commercial varieties, and some of them are quite a bit more black rot resistant than others. I just don't want to say unless I'm looking actually at one of these tables to see. I don't want to mislead anyone
Okay,
by
great.
making a guess at it. But
I'll see
in
if I
the
can find
black
one of
rot,
those tables to include
yeah,
in the notes. Yeah.
one of them's on a commercial nursery's website.
Oh,
Um,
yeah. I have seen that. Yeah. Okay, great. Do you, I mean, I know you mentioned climate change is potentially bringing out fungal pathogens. It seems like without question that's happening with um, diseases that come through insect vectors. Is that something that you've worked with as well? Some of the, like Pierce's disease is something that obviously is endemic to where I am, and seems to be spreading north each year. Um, and seems like there's other examples of that. Is that something that you guys look at as well?
so, well, most of the diseases that the grape breeding program has worked on have not been insect vectored. Um, there are some insect vectored viruses that are of concern, but finding genetic resistance to those viruses is a pretty difficult task. Um,
Gotcha.
we did find out. Um, Now, let me I'm not going to go that direction. I think that would take us off on a tangent. But
Okay.
uh, but there, most of the diseases that we've dealt with are simply spread by sporulation, conidia production or oospore production, as in downy mildew and powdery mildew with conidia and conidia-4 production. Um, Black rot is also spread, more spread by wind and splashing and
Right.
than anything else. So Pierce's disease, though, I should mention in relation to our conversation about hybrid grapes that the University of California, Davis developed 5 new varieties that I would call hybrid varieties
Right. Yeah.
because the genes for Pierce's disease resistance that Andy Walker, long-term, now retired professor of viticulture and grape breeding at UC Davis, developed. Um, the genes for resistance to Pierce's disease came from Vitis arizonica, um,
Yes.
a species native to western grape species native to western United States, and the percentage of vinifera in the background of these 5 new varieties like Caminante and Paseante, it's 87.5% vinifera or more than 90% vinifera in some cases.
Right.
So, and again, speaking to the question of quality, these have all been really well tested for quality and suitability for production. I think they find a lot of people do like the wines made from these new varieties.
Yeah, I've had them and definitely can speak to that for sure.
Yeah,
I they
great.
were yeah, they're fantastic, honestly. I well, I wanted to then maybe sort of talk about what your grapes have been that you've developed in since 1980. If you can, I know there's been 10 wine grapes that have come out, been introduced that I'm aware of. Maybe there's more, but if you wanted to, I don't know if you want to talk about all 10, but I wouldn't mind if you named all 10 and then sort of talked about the characteristics and of some of the most popular or your favorite, or or however you want to approach that.
Sure. I think uh, let's start with Traminette because that became one of
Yeah,
the most accepted and most widespread grapes that wine grapes that came out
I
of Cornell.
I
My predecessors had developed the Cayuga White grape in
oh, okay.
1972, and that's very widely grown and very
Yeah,
versatile um, for sparkling wine and
yeah,
dry wine production, as well as sweeter versions, and for blending and varietals. It's been a highly versatile grape and very productive.
yeah. I
So,
actually have Traminette growing in my front yard, as well as New York Muscat, um,
oh,
Vidal, Vidal Blanc, and Brianna. So some fun stuff. But yeah, I've
yeah,
recommended Traminette to several people because of that. It's like if you blind tasted somebody on a Traminette versus a Gewürztraminer, I would be shocked if they could tell you
yeah,
which was which. Yeah.
yeah. I think one of the most fun little milestones in my career was 10 or 15 years ago being at a big wine tasting event at the Watkins Glen racetrack and hearing people behind me going up to a winemaker's booth and asking, "Do you have a Traminette? We tasted some really good Traminette. Do you also have a Traminette?" And it was just one of those feel good moments to hear someone asking about one of your grapes
That's great.
uh, so yeah, I love Traminette. It has a wonderful aroma, much easier to grow than Gewürztraminer. I love Gewürztraminer too, but boy, Traminette is much easier to grow in eastern U.S. and other areas. And I've tasted even richer versions from Missouri, where they can ripen a little further. They ripen under different conditions, um, and lighter, fruitier versions in cool regions. But it's much more disease resistant, much more cold hardy, and has a much better sugar acid pH balance than Gewürztraminer, where the pH can sometimes go pretty high and can be difficult for a winemaker to deal with a high pH grape and
Hmm.
bring that in to suitable numbers.
Yeah.
Um, After that, I think Valvin Muscat was another very important grape in the history of the Geneva grape breeding program.
Mm.
Um, when we named it along with two other grapes, Noiret and Coro Noir. Noiret and Coro Noir were red wine grapes. And the thinking at the time was that, well, Valvin Muscat will probably find a small place in helping make Rieslings a little more fruity, a little more aromatic, and instead, all these varietal Valvin Muscats started popping up,
Huh.
um, and uh, it was hitting the market. I guess kind of simultaneous with the Moscato movement.
Oh, yeah.
People becoming more and more aware of Moscatos from Italy overseas, and so wineries in New York would make a beautiful Muscat from Valvin Muscat, sometimes labeled as Valvin Muscat, sometimes just labeled as Muscat or Moscato. and it uh, became quite popular. Um, so that was really nice to see. Personally, I love eating the fresh fruit. It has seeds. It would never really make it as a table grape, but um, Adam, if you're ever with me in a vineyard full of Valvin Muscat, I think you and I would have a great time.
I've made some wine with just a an orange muscat out here, a muscat canelli, and same thing. I'm sure they're related, of course. And I mean, it's like I was like, why would I make wine out of this? This stuff is so delicious by itself. I wanted to eat the whole ton of grapes.
And
Um,
there's a winery in Ithaca, New York, called Ports of New York, which makes a port style wine from Valvin Muscat.
oh, delicious! Yeah,
Beautiful.
that sounds incredible. What can you talk about Valvin Muscat and Traminette in terms of their fungal resistances? Are they? I mean, obviously, yeah, I mean, I think that's what you meant when you said they're easier to grow. Traminette's easier to grow than Gewürztraminer. But I mean, can you talk about what what care would be necessary, or how resistant they are to the pressures,
Yeah.
or what pressures they're resistant to?
So many of, as background, many of the French American hybrid grapes have medium resistance to downy mildew, powdery mildew. Some are more or less resistant to black rot, but then none of them are what I would, or few of them are what I'd say are highly resistant to those diseases.
Right.
Um, and I'd put Traminette and Valvin Muscat in that same category. They are not as resistant as the newest generation of disease resistant grapes that we're working on, that Maddie Oravik is working on now in the grape breeding program,
Hmm.
or the Arundel grape that was one of the later wine grape releases that came out of the disease resistance breeding program at Cornell.
Hmm.
Um, so both of them are have pretty good resistance to powdery mildew, Traminette and Valvin Muscat. Uh, and Traminette is intermediate in resistance to downy mildew. With downy mildew, you do have to watch out on for leaf downy mildew on Valvin Muscat. It
Right.
has so maybe slightly more resistance than vinifera, but you would have to control downy mildew when conditions are right. The moisture levels are right for downy mildew to develop. So they are generally good improvements and require fewer sprays, usually half the number of sprays for disease control is what you would vinifera grapes would require. But the newer generations will hopefully be down to one, two, three sprays per year,
Wow.
per season.
And on the West Coast, I, some of even that, even though it's medium resistance, I mean, we generally don't have to deal with downy at all out here anyway, and powdery is our main one. So if it has a little more, if it's half as good, or I guess half again as good as a vinifera in terms of powdery resistance, we could almost probably get away with no spray in California and other, sort of West Coast Mediterranean arid growing regions, is my guess. Have you seen anything done out here? I mean, I'm pretty aware of people growing what, and I do know a lot of no spray hybrids that are being grown in California. I mean, not a lot, but relative to
Yeah,
the number of hybrids being grown here, the ones that are being grown, you don't have to spray. But I don't know if you have any experience with that in terms of other climates other than West Coast climates. I mean, East Coast climates for those grapes.
yeah. Most of my experience is on the East Coast. I think I've heard anecdotally about some success growing some of the hybrids with medium resistance under no spray conditions, and my but I would have to mention, Adam, that my plant pathology um, colleagues um, do not recommend that you, even if you can make it through a season or two or three without spraying at all, they would not recommend that, as that provides the ideal conditions for a pathogen to mutate and overcome the genes for resistance.
Oh,
So
interesting.
you might still want to incorporate some organic materials now and then.
Right.
Um, we again, this is an active area of research, and early on as a breeder, I took that no spray approach, but I'm listening to my plant pathology colleagues, and just as I've seen some intermediate level of susceptibility develop, a slight susceptibility develop among the hybrids with the best gene I know of for powdery mildew resistance, which is the RUN1 gene from the muscadine grape. And sometimes we do see a little powdery mildew growing on those vines now. It's not too bad, but I don't want that to get any worse. So I'm taking the
Huh.
approach, the last few years, we took the approach in my career of spraying a couple of times.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm interested to hear that. It makes me want to ask you, and maybe you don't have an answer for this, but I wonder historically what people did. I mean, for thousands of years we've been growing grapes. I imagine spraying it hasn't always been part of that. Um,
Right.
like
Yeah.
what was do you have any sense of like I mean were there sprays that were natural or natural treatments that you're aware of? I mean this is something I feel like I should be have researched, but just very curious about that, because I mean I guess part of me is you know there's the lazy aspect, or maybe you could call it efficiency, and like, but I don't want to spray if I don't have to, and
Sure.
I would love to build a system that had its own natural resilience and resistances, and could stay healthy by its own genetic wherewithal, um, and not that I wouldn't do anything for it, not that I'm just going to neglect it, but that my care could be teas or composts or just general health, in terms of nutrition and things like that, and cycling nutrients and creating conditions that are optimal for health for the plants. But I don't know if you have any thoughts or knowledge about like historically what's been done, or any thoughts about that in general.
Yeah. I'm not. First of all, I'm not going to say that I've researched how grapes were grown to a thorough degree um, prior to the 1850s or 1840s. Um, but let me offer a couple of thoughts. One is that uh, people put up with some insect and disease damage
Yeah,
um, and lower yields.
yeah,
People just accepted, okay, there's going to be some blemished fruit, there are going to be some insects that get into the vineyard, um, and we'll just deal with that. When Prior to the arrival of phylloxera and then downy mildew, powdery mildew, black rot into Europe, they didn't have to do anything to control those diseases. They weren't there.
right,
So when did they arrive? It would be mid to late 1800s.
right, right,
Um, and that led to the development of knowledge about sulfur for the control of powdery mildew, and then Bordeaux mix, where Bordeaux mixture, copper and lime.
right,
Well, now you have a chemical treatment that could control downy mildew, but also lead over years and years of usage to higher levels of copper in the soil than what's desired.
right,
Um, so um, I like to think about, how do our wild grapes like Riparia and Vulpina, and how do these do so well? Some of them look so healthy in the wild, and part of the answer is, well, they have genes for resistance. They've co-evolved with the pathogens for many years.
right,
Um, but they're also highly variable, and um, each every time you see a bunch of vulpinovines or riparian vines, well, there are a whole bunch of them that come from different seeds. They're
Right.
different original seedlings, so you have genetic variability out there compared to a Chardonnay vineyard. Every
Right.
single Chardonnay plant derived from a single seedling,
Right.
and they were cloned. And
Right.
so we work with a monoculture in viticulture, and we work with among French grape varieties. So many of them are closely related. They're siblings or they're first cousins. It's such a narrow genetic base, even within vinifera.
Yeah.
Um, so we kind of have a deck stacked against us when we just talk about some of the French varieties. There's a little more variability among the Italian, and there's great variability when you get to Georgia and Armenia, the closest to the homeland for European grapes, the vinifera grapes, and where they originated between the Black and Caspian Seas. And
Right.
then, DNA studies show that all those varieties in that region are so much more variable than the narrow genetic base that we deal with in
Huh.
Western Europe.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah. Can you envision of can you I mean, this is, I don't know how this would happen, but if somebody had the wherewithal to do the DNA analysis of a bunch of seedlings and selected the ones with with great resistance markers in the genome, and planted a whole vineyard of seedlings, can you envision something like that as a nice way to start thinking about having a natural recreation of what's happening in the woods of New England and the Appalachian Mountains? Um, I don't know. Yeah, I just throw that as a way to like maybe get it closer to combining human ends of needing grapes that taste decent, and
Yeah,
so many seedlings turn out to be sterile or whatever, at least in my experience. So yeah, I don't know if you have any
I'll
thoughts about
give you an answer that will even surprise me, and I'll say, "Wow, that would be really interesting."
that.
um, not only from the perspective of planting out seedlings with a variety of different sources of genetic resistance, natural resistance to disease, but you know how in wine blends. One grape variety often complements another and another.
Right.
And winemakers work very carefully and thoroughly, meticulously to find the right blends. Um, but the idea of a field blend,
Right.
one variety could be compensating for deficiencies, and another could be complementing the good characteristics of another. Um, yeah, it would be an interesting experiment. Now, it takes a cultural shift to get
Hmm.
there, right?
Yeah, talk about that. What do you mean
Oh,
by that?
um, the culture of wine growing, the culture of
Hmm.
wine growing, I guess. Wine growers for centuries have cultivated single varieties, um, but it's not unheard of, even in New York viticulture, to talk about hills in a vineyard. I know some of the old vineyards where um, some of the old timers in the industry would say, "Oh, we had my dad planted 3 hills of Agawam here and 4 hills of Catawba over there," and they had some
Oh,
field mixtures.
right.
Um,
Yeah,
a
here
hill
in
was just a single variety,
I mean,
single vine.
we still have some historic vineyards here that were planted, I think, with that idea in mind. Where every vine is a different vine. I mean, these were planted from cuttings, obviously, not seedlings, but there's probably 30 varieties in a single vineyard. on a single
Hmm.
hillside, and every other vine is different. It's not like they put all the Zinfandel together and all the, whatever together, Carignan together. It's like this one is this and the next one is this, and they're just scattered throughout an entire vineyard of that. So
So
they did that. Maybe they were just experimenting to see what would do well there because it was, their first planting, but maybe it was also a form of diversification to have, some sort of consistency in terms of harvest, to guarantee that no matter how the vintage would happen, they would have some of those varieties would turn out all right and make up for the ones that didn't turn out all right. But yeah, it's a I love the idea of doing it with seedlings too. And sorry, you were going to interject there.
oh no, no, I'm just listening, and I'm thinking about um, one other aspect of going with this very novel change to vineyards with multiple varieties is how do you then perpetuate combinations that seem to do well?
Yeah.
If can you keep track of each individual type out there, what the proportions, or do you just propagate seedlings from seedlings?
Right,
Hmm,
right. Yeah, yeah. Like, do you then start cloning the ones that seem to do well, or do you just make seedlings from the ones that tend to do well
yeah.
and replacing the ones that are not doing well? I also think in marketing, we're up against this idea of varietal marketing, where
Hmm.
the variety of grape is so important to people in their understanding of wine now. When you look at the way European wine has been named and labeled for years, it's based on the region, and
Hmm.
within that there's potential for diversity in many of the regions. I mean, some it's pretty limited, but that idea of like maybe bringing that back, where you're talking about hills, like this is,
Hmm.
the wine from the wine from, whatever Spencer Hill, and it's like you don't care what the variety is because it has its own year to year distinctiveness that comes from whatever the seedling varieties are that do well there. Anyway, that's just me speculating a whole cultural shift that you're talking about.
Yeah, yes, and part of the cultural shift would have to be among the consumers too, right? If
Right. Yeah.
if you're if you're bottling wines, you're from vineyards like this, um, you're looking at something more like a blend, right? And a
Right.
generic type wine could also be special, just like Burgundy as a label is special.
Right.
Um, Bordeaux has can have a combination of 5 or 6 different red varieties. Uh, so um, uh, so you're going back to something that could still be special, but cannot be labeled as varietal, right?
Yeah. 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 Interesting. Um, Now, I don't know. I mean, we tangented there from talking about some varieties. And I just wanted to go back in case there were some more varieties you want to talk about. But it, two of the ones that you mentioned, Cayuga White and Coro Noir, I've heard really good things about in terms of. Well, I mean, I know somebody in the Mid Atlantic in Virginia who is growing them organically, and so that speaks to um, their resilience and resistance. Even still, they seem to be doing really well
Hmm.
in a very difficult region, a place with like hot, humid, crazy conditions, like a perfect storm of horror for grapevine growers, basically. And they seem to be doing well. So I don't know, if there's others, like if you have anecdotal knowledge about those from people growing them, or if there are others like that you've heard are just the rock stars in terms of their resilience or resistance to things.
Yeah, there's been talking about Virginia. There's also been some success with our Arundel, A
Arundel,
R
right?
A R A N D E L L, and people have made some excellent wines in Virginia from Arundel. Um, we never saw much black rot on it in New York, but there's been a little more black rot occurring on Arundel in Virginia. Of course, the conditions are better for black rot in Virginia than they are
Right,
in our New York vineyards.
right.
but it's always had very good resistance to powdery mildew and downy mildew,
Right.
and that's how it was selected. Um, Initially, I walked through vineyards one year with under severe downy mildew conditions with nurseryman Herman Amberg and his son Eric Amberg. And this was one of the seedlings that stood out when there was so much downy mildew under no spray conditions. Arundel looked clean and made very good wines year after year after that.
Wow.
So, so that's been, one I would call attention to. Um, and you mentioned Coral Noir. And that's pretty broadly disease resistant, easy to grow, winter hardy, high yielding. Uh, it's uh, it was thought that that would be even more successful. I think it's had some good success, but not as much as we had imagined. It makes a nice sort of light, easy to drink red wine.
Mm.
Um, And at the same time that we named it, we also named Noire, um,
Right.
which has a little more distinctive black pepper and a little bit of green pepper and dark color. And um, uh, uh, one of the few red wine grapes with a little bit of tannin among the hybrid red wine grapes.
Oh.
Um, and people said, well, at the time that it probably won't be so widespread because it has too strong a flavor, too much of this, too much of that, and instead it became much more widespread than Coral Noir. It's a little more susceptible than Coral Noir to downy mildew, reasonably resistant to powdery mildew, like many of the French American hybrids. Um,
Mhm.
can be very high yielding. Um, and one has to manage the vigor. If you're a grower, it can be over vigorous. Generally, it's grown on its own roots, like most of our grapes are from
Mhm.
the Geneva program. Uh, but um, uh, but it's made some excellent wines from Illinois to Missouri to Virginia, Ohio, New York, and elsewhere.
Yeah. You said Israel even. Um,
Israel as well. Yes.
it sounds like a good candidate for California in that sense. You th- any whites? You mentioned Chardonnay. Was that one of the ones that you developed during your time
Um,
there?
Chardonnay, um, the cross was made many years before I started working at
Okay,
Cornell,
gotcha.
but like many of my releases were started by my predecessors.
Got it. Got
And
it.
that's how long some of the wine grape development takes. It sometimes takes a career.
Right.
But Arundel, I went through two generations of crossing um, to get through to Arundel, and the cross for that, was 1995, and it was released about 18 years later. Um, so it was pretty quick from cross to release. So Chardonnay, yeah, I was the one that made the decision to release it. It was known as GW9 for many years before, and it was never that notable in its growth in production and wine quality in New York State. But colleagues in Michigan and Arkansas really saw a place for it there and were supplying me with lots of feedback and data that justified release. And I went with their strong recommendations, and we put it out there. And there's some success with Chardonnay in New York, but it's at some point became the number one white wine grape in the state of Missouri.
Huh.
Um, and then there was some retrenchment as a virus that was little known began to hurt some of the plantings.
Oh,
Um, yeah, so sometimes you get the unexpected.
yeah.
But it did very well, and it's still grown to some extent pretty broadly. Um, yeah, so Chardonnay is out there. The other one I would mention is a brand new one that's gotten a lot of notoriety from write-ups in Wine Enthusiast and other media sources, and that's Aravel,
Aravel, right,
Aravelle.
right.
Um, it's a Cayuga White Riesling hybrid. It's a cross I made in the first year I had an opportunity to make crosses, 1981. Um, and Went through quite a lot of testing, and I was losing interest in it, but people in the industry came back and said, Bruce, you're not looking at this in the right way. And You have to listen to the growers who are testing it and the winemakers who are testing it sometimes, and realize that your own perspective is not always the most important. But the growers and the winemakers were coming back. Well, we knew the winemakers were right. It made excellent wine,
Right.
but the growers were saying it really has a place for us. And while it might not be um, fully as winter hardy as Bruce Reisch would have liked, it's really resistant to botrytis bunch rot, which in a
Mm,
Riesling type grape is very important in New York. Growers are often spraying to control botrytis and picking their Rieslings to stay ahead of rot that comes in, because botrytis could get started, and then you have other rots that get started. They're not as noble rot, and so
right.
the growers were pointing out that with the rot resistant of this grape, you could let it ripen more fully. It
Mm,
ripens a little earlier anyway than Riesling, and the wine is very much Riesling-like. So we agreed with that last part, and um, I had to begin to trust them and see for myself how rot resistant this was. So then we went into the final stages of testing and released that in 2023. That's a long
fantastic.
time from cross to release, but um,
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
uh,
it's good
COVID co- COVID got in the way a little bit, but
is
yeah.
when you say, it's not as cold hardy as you'd like it to be, do you have a rating factor for that? Like, what is what temperatures do you feel that it is safe down to, or what grow zone do you feel like is optimal for it?
We feel it's uh, pretty safe to the level where Riesling could survive and come through the winters pretty well. It doesn't seem to get trunk damage in New
Okay.
York winters,
Wow.
and we will get some bud damage when Riesling gets bud damage. So I'm not. I really try not to put an exact temperature
Gotcha.
on the
Yeah.
hardiness levels, because that could be a little deceiving, because -10 that was preceded by a few days above 40 will cause a lot more damage than -10 Fahrenheit that's preceded by consistent temperatures in the 20s and 30s.
Right. Right.
So so it's a good zone 5 grape, um, and in the Finger Lakes region and similar regions, it does very well, and it's higher yielding than Riesling would be.
Lovely. And any others that you want to mention, or did we cover most?
Um, I'm probably leaving something out.
That's all right. That's all right. Um, no, that's great. That's a great start. Well, in terms of like where you see, I have two questions for you. Like, if you have any thoughts about, the future of breeding in general, or just what you hope to see, and where you'd like to see cultural shifts happen that maybe would be necessary to make these changes more palatable, um, as well as any advice you have for somebody who is going to plant a vineyard, going to replant or add in new varieties, or, maybe if there's any thoughts you have for somebody who wants to try their hand at home breeding, anything like that. Obviously, you've already, like, the big cautionary tale is it can take a long time to anybody, which is why it's been institutionalized so well,
Yeah.
because it's like intergenerational work is being done. But yeah, anything along those lines, if you have.
Well, yeah, sure. There are a lot of parts to that question, Adam.
Yeah.
So let me try to
I should have
see if
just
I can
asked one of
remember.
those questions.
The home breeder should make sure that they connect themselves with the North American Grape Breeders group on the internet. I think they have a Google group that
Yeah. Yeah.
discusses grape breeding, uh, very thoroughly and very professionally. There are a number of very serious private breeders. They're not company or corporate, but they are doing grape breeding on their own resources, either from Maine to Michigan to Missouri to the Upper Midwest and even some in California. So so be sure to connect with others and learn from their experiences. A super group of people who love to share experience and learn from each other out there.
Yeah.
And it is time consuming, long term. It's not easy at all. Um, uh, but it's very satisfying when you do come up with something like Tom Plocker in the Upper Midwest, who has come up with a number of varieties from his own private breeding program that are having a real impact in super cold areas of the United States.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so, on the as to where the science of grape breeding is going, I think um, we're in the last 20 years really picking apart what I might call the low hanging fruit, the single genes that can be more easily manipulated in a breeding program. And that's been important. There are a lot of single genes that greatly affect the type of grape that greatly affect the phenotype, greatly affect the level of disease resistance or certain flavors or certain growth characteristics. So it's great to employ those single genes, but there are a number of um, traits and characteristics, the complexities of wine aroma, wine flavor, that which interact so much with the yeast strain and location. But getting a handle on the more quantitative aspects of grape breeding and the traits that are controlled by the expression of many genes simultaneously, I think will be one of the challenges for the grape breeders that are um, advancing this area of science. Um, this area has been very much deployed in maize breeding and breeding of sweet potatoes and other crops. Um, but we're only at the beginning of deploying what's known as, for instance, genomic selection on grape breeding.
Yeah.
Genomic selection being selection based on the characteristics of the entire genome, many parts of the genome all at once.
Right. And this is just to put everyone at ease. This is very different than like what is referred to as GMO. This is just analyzing natural crossing to see what's
Yeah,
there and then selecting to speed up the process so that you're not waiting for the 3-year process of grapes to grow to a certain level where they can produce fruit, and then you can evaluate the fruit, and that whole, which can, that's the slow process, is that thing. This speeds that up by just analyzing the genetics and saying, oh, we should select these because they have what we're looking for in the genome.
Yes, even in genomic selection, we're still talking about making crosses and planting seeds.
Right.
And the selection process, it uses a lot of computer power to deploy this type of selection process, but the result is greater efficiency in the program and the ability to use the computing power and the knowledge of genetics to better predict the traits that you should find in groups of seedlings. There is another aspect of modern genetics that's called gene editing, which involves editing or altering the um, the alphabet in the DNA, altering the sequence of bases. And it's not genetic modification, but you're simply changing, you're causing some mutations to occur in known places that should help improve the seedlings, the new grapes that are produced from the process. Um, and I think the official ruling in the United States has been that the products of gene editing would not be considered genetically modified because, again, no foreign DNA is being introduced. You're just mutating or modifying the DNA that's currently there.
Oh, interesting.
Um, so that's something else that researchers are looking at and finding some success in grapes, but nothing's commercialized from it. And um, uh, but it holds some promise in being able to, let's say, take Merlot, modify it, and develop some powdery mildew resistant forms of Merlot.
Have you gotten into epigenetics at all? And I mean, your mentioning of gene editing makes me think of that because I feel like, uh, I mean, and my understanding is pretty basic, so correct me if I'm way off. But it seems like on with epigenetics, you're letting environmental factors do some of that expressioning in the genome versus like human ends would be come into play when we're editing the genes.
Mhm.
um I mean, have you looked into epigenetics and its impact? Do you think about that in relation to
I,
breeding?
yes, I'm glad you mentioned it. I personally, I think epigenetics are a fascinating subject, and I never went down that path. I think as a researcher, you can sometimes only do so much, and you have to pick and choose your direction.
Yeah.
To go in the direction of epigenetics would require a pretty focused effort, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So I've instead been on the sidelines, reading what some others have been doing in this area. Um, and I've been fascinated by a group in New Zealand that was looking into epigenetics and altering gene expression through epigenetic changes. So I'm not sure if all of your listeners know exactly what epigenetics
Yep.
is or can be, but
Please feel free to give any kind of definition or explanation. Yeah.
it's ways in which you're not changing the sequence of bases, the alphabet that defines what a gene that defines a gene and what it is, but you might be modifying, let's say, methyl groups that control whether or not a certain gene is expressed. And
Right.
methyl groups are attaching to the DNA, and if a region of DNA is highly methylated, you reduce expression. If it's not so methylated, you increase expression. So that's one example, but it's a way to modify gene expression without modifying the gene itself.
Right. And this happens naturally, as I understand it, by things like, if a plant parent goes through drought stress consistently, at the time that it's creating seeds, then those seeds might have a potential, that part of its genome expressed that is a little more conservative with water usage or something like that. I don't know. Is that a
Right.
that's a rough example, but I don't know, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, approximately, right. Or it could be a portion of the genome that's suppressed that would make a plant more drought susceptible.
Got it. Got it. I see. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I guess my interest in this is thinking about localizing breeding in this way, especially natural breeding, if you're growing out seedlings from your area that are exposed to the environmental conditions of your vineyard area, your region where you're growing grapes, you might have more success dealing with those specific regional pressures in that sense, because the genome of will be related to the epigenetics pressures that have come about in that area. I don't know if I'm way off on that, but just a thought.
Yeah, well, you could be right, but the thing is, we don't know.
Right.
We don't know exactly.
Another hypothesis. All right.
It might be how epigenetics works in grapes, but I think we're just beginning to learn from some of the researchers that are taking a really focused study, a focused look to see um, how methylated certain regions of grape DNA might be and how that's affecting the characteristics of these varieties. And so we're just beginning to learn, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, that seems like a great place to end this. Unless you have anything that I haven't asked you that you should say that I should have asked you.
Oh, maybe one more thing I would mention, and
Yeah, please.
I did have a chance to mention, yeah, in this area of hybrid grape breeding, and um, why should more and more people be interested in hybrid grapes? First of all, I'll be sharing with you soon a link to a lecture that Tim Martinson and I just gave.
Okay.
Um, but I do want to mention that we're not alone here in North America in developing hybrid grapes. Obviously,
Right.
in North America, we have these efforts in the southeast to develop seedless muscadines
Yeah.
using seedless genes from vinifera. There are the efforts in the upper Midwest to develop super winter hardy grapes derived from Vitis riparia and other winter hardy species, crossed with hybrid French hybrids and vinifera. And then Andy Walker's um, advances in PD resistant grapes were mentioned.
Yeah.
In Europe, there are big efforts in at Guy Wallerhof, Federal Research Station for Grapevine Breeding in Germany, um, to
Italy.
develop disease resistant grapes.
Mm.
Then there are new Italian grape varieties that are also hybrids with high levels of disease resistance. And then the Resdur project, uh, which stands for Durable Resistance Project, coming out of France. And where even the rules about what can be planted and where things can be planted are now including many of these new Resdur varieties like Voltus and Artaban, which came from the first series. Then there's a second series of durable resistance grapes in Europe that are being authorized for wine production in different regions. So the idea of trying to grow grapes more sustainably is not just restricted to what we're doing or uh, what we're doing in different regions of the United States, but it's happening in Asia, in China, and Korea, and in Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Quite a lot of work has taken place.
Yeah.
Um, so what will the world of viticulture look like in 5, 10, 20 years? I think the further out you go, I think the more change we'll be seeing.
Yeah.
Um,
I
you don't replant vineyards overnight, so change is slow.
Yeah, yeah, it seems. So this is just a fun fact, but as I was doing a little research about the term foxy, I discovered that the most planted grape on Earth is actually a Labrusca hybrid. And it's because it's the Kyoho grape, and it's because the Chinese have planted so much acreage of it. It actually
Oh,
they've planted more acreage of Kyoho than there is Cabernet on Earth. Um,
really?
yeah.
Really?
So I thought that was a fun thing. The most planted grape on Earth is actually a Labrusca hybrid. Um,
Oh my God. Thanks for telling me that. I've tasted Kyoho, and I even developed. It's a tetraploid grape hybrid of Labrusca and Vinifera. Um, and I even did some breeding of tetraploid seedless table grapes, not with Kyoho, but with other Japanese varieties. So,
uh-huh. What did you?
resulting in Everest seedless resulted from those efforts.
Oh wow,
Um, and it's a Concord like large berried seedless grape, naturally large berried, but very Labrusca like in terms of having a slip skin, a juicy pulp, and Labrusca flavor.
nice. Have you had a wine from Kyoho or just the fresh grapes?
I've only had the fresh grapes.
Yeah, I've only heard of one wine made in Japan. I've never had it, but I heard it was really remarkable. So
Hmm,
fun stuff too. But yeah,
very
um,
fun.
yeah. Well, Bruce, thank you so much for this. I really appreciate this, and I think this is a lot of amazing information for people to get a context about what you've done and helped move forward in the realm of hybrid. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Adam. I really enjoyed talking with you about this whole topic. It's really fun to talk about.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. I want to thank all of you who support this podcast through donations, Patreon subscriptions, sponsorships, or just posting a great review and telling a friend. You make this podcast possible, and I'm honored and humbled and inspired by your support. If you'd like to support this podcast, you'll find links to all the ways you can support it in the show notes.